Welcome to A Generation Under Pressure, Talking Mental Health at UC Berkeley. I'm Henry Brady, Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. It certainly seems like a time of anxiety given the daily news and the state of our world. It also seems like costs and the stakes for going to college have increased for college students. College is more expensive. Housing costs in the Bay Area are soaring. Jobs seem harder to get. The internet brings a daily barrage of distressing news. With these concerns in mind, the Berkeley Institute for the Future of Young Americans of the Goldman School of Public Policy, under the leadership of Sarah Swanbeck, has undertaken a study of anxiety disorder on college campuses. The mission of the Berkeley Institute for the Future of Young Americans is to identify public policy issues of major importance to young Americans. Certainly, the growing problem of anxiety disorders among young people is an important public policy concern. The study that we've done was suggested by and carried out by an eminent faculty member of the Goldman School of Public Policy and of the School of Public Health, Professor Richard Scheffler. Professor Scheffler is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Health Economics and Public Policy. He is also the director of the Petrus Center for Healthcare Markets and Consumer Welfare, endowed by the California Office of the Attorney General. Dr. Scheffler has been a visiting scholar at the World Bank, the Rockefeller Foundation in Bellagio, the Institute of Medicine at the National Academy of Sciences, and a consultant for the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the OECD. He received the Carl Taub Award in 2004, honoring distinguished contributions to the field of mental health services research. In 2015, he was awarded the Gold Medal from Charles University in Prague for his longstanding and continued support of international scientific and educational collaboration. He's an elected member of the International Health Economists Association and the National Academy of Social Insurance. In 2018, Dr. Scheffler was awarded the Berkeley Citation, among the highest honors the campus bestows on its community, presented on behalf of the Chancellor to individuals whose contributions to UC Berkeley go beyond the call of duty and whose achievements exceed the standards of excellence in their fields. He continues in that tradition with the study that he's going to report on today. He's going to begin our session by summarizing his study that he did in collaboration with Daniel Arnold, Jesse Harney, Ben Kane, Lauren Lind, Katarina Liu, Luke O'Neill, Hanaya Quasi, and Nikki Vora. After his presentation, we will turn to a student response by Katie Chu, Chair, ASUC Mental Health Commission, and then to a panel consisting of our Chancellor, Carol Christ, Kenna Hazelwood-Carter, former President of the Graduate Assembly, Guy Nicolette, Assistant Vice Chancellor, University Health Services, and Sam Koo, Internal Director, ASUC Mental Health Commission. We'll then turn to audience question and answer, and at 4 p.m., there will be a reception with tables out there for people giving information about services available at UC Berkeley to help with anxiety and other mental health issues. To start our session, please welcome Professor Richard Scheffler to the stage. Good to have you here.
Okay, my slides work. I'm off to a good start. Thank you so much for coming in on such a beautiful spring day in Berkeley. I know this must be an important topic, particularly for the students. So I'm excited about presenting some new work from a study that is ongoing. It'll be finished pretty soon. Before I give you the results, I'm just going to spend less than a minute telling you how I got interested in this. So I returned from a sabbatical around 2008 and walked into my undergraduate class in health economics and public policy with about 150 students. And I kind of looked around, and there's something had changed in the room. The mood had changed. The atmosphere had changed. Something had happened. I didn't quite know what it was, but I did notice something that was pretty obvious. Less than half the students were not looking at me, but looking at their screens. And though I asked them to shut it off, it actually took me 3 times to get everybody to shut it off And eventually, with 5 or 6 students, I literally had to go and take their iPhone out of their hands. That was the beginning of my observation that something was going on the Berkeley campus. Flip 10 years later now, and luckily I got the opportunity to do this study with the Goldman School, and I'm grateful for that. I wanted to take a look at exactly what really happened and what was going on. So what I'm about to show you is an overview of some of the preliminary findings that I have, that a study will come out just in several weeks. So Henry has already talked about the Berkeley Institute. Being a professor, you have to have an outline. I won't go through it methodologically, but I'm going to talk to you about the major trends in anxiety disorder that we found. And particularly, we're looking at college students and the new millennials. Identified some of the causal factors, some of the serious consequences, and then I'll summarize some of my results. I'm going to try to do all this in 10 minutes, more or less. So there's a data set called the National College Health Assessment. It's been conducted on campuses throughout the United States since 2000. And we were able to get this data set. It has currently, from 2008 to 16, 926,000 college students filled it out. Following that, we were able to get permission from the UC President's office to actually look at the surveys that were handed in to this organization from the Berkeley campus for the same time period. The CSUs also cooperated, but unfortunately we're able to get 1 year's worth of data because they entered the study later on. From that data, the big aha and the big takeaway, and if you remember anything about this talk, I hope it's this, that currently now 1 out of every 5 students, or 20% of the undergraduates now, report being treated or diagnosed for anxiety disorder on college campuses. The blue line is the Berkeley line, or actually the whole UC line. You see it looks a little bit lower, but the answer is it's really not, because when you adjust for the demographics and the different population that comes in, those lines are pretty much identical. The important thing is the slope of the line and the rate of increase. So what you see from my observation in 2008, looking at the national numbers, it was 10%, and 8 years later, it's 20%. Now, being partly in the School of Public Health, when something goes from 10% to 20% in doubles, that legitimately can be called an epidemic. So my title for this talk and this study is Anxiety Disorder, the New Epidemic on College Campuses. There are, of course, questions about anxiety disorder and other mental health problems. It's not the only thing going on the campuses. But let's just take a look at the UC numbers. The blue one all the way to the left is that rate of increase, the more than doubling that we already talked about. The gray line is other mental health disorders, so everything's going up. But the question is, anxiety disorder has gone up more rapidly than other mental health problems and depression, and is now the #1 diagnosis on college campuses throughout the United States. You see a similar pattern for the national numbers as well. There are significant differences in gender and race. Interestingly enough, these numbers are quite significant. This is the national numbers. You see for transgenders now, by 2016, over half of them are being diagnosed or treated with anxiety disorder. And you can see the different rates. I don't have time to go through them. What's interesting and you need to know is these are probably undercounts, because these are students being diagnosed and treated. There's a whole bunch of other students that have not been diagnosed and are not being treated. So the number is actually much higher, and there's something called a true prevalence rate, which is many points higher than the numbers we're looking at. So let's take a look just briefly at the UC numbers, and the one that I want to flag is the number under blacks, which is 19%. The reason I'm flagging that is because if you go back and look at the national rates and the UC rates, they look pretty consistent, except the rate for blacks on the campus is much higher in UC than it is across the nation, 14% versus 19%. These are the rates for the CSUs. They show a similar pattern, but they're at a somewhat lower rate. And again, we only have 1 year's worth of data, so we're not able to show you a time trend. The other interesting observation in the data is that the rate of treatment and diagnosis of anxiety disorder on the campus goes up as the students move through the system. So in the freshman year, it's 17%. And those who stay on to the fifth year as an undergraduate, it's almost 25%. So there's something going on through the years. The other obvious hypothesis, and this is just a hypothesis, but we're checking into it, is by the time they're in their third or fourth year, they're seriously thinking about having to get a job or go to graduate school, and so the rate of anxiety increases significantly. This is very important information for the clinics and the people who are treating these populations to understand that this problem gets worse and not better. Even though they might be more comfortable and understand the campus, the still rate of anxiety goes up as they move through their undergraduate years. We identified 3 causal factors, and Henry's mentioned one already. It is true in the data that screen time correlates with higher anxiety. The screen time we measured was screen time in leisure time, not work time. And so if you go from more than 20 hours a week of screen time to less than 5 hours, the likelihood of being diagnosed with anxiety disorder increases a whopping 50%. And again, it's complicated to know. These are correlations, not necessarily causation. We found in another part of the study we did with a team of graduate students that Henry named, 2 of them got involved in actually interviewing undergraduates at Berkeley, 30 of them, with 1-hour interviews to try to get a sense of what's happening under the numbers. And these interviews produced some incredible results. I'll just give you a couple of sound bites. We had more than one student say, "Something feels like I'm drowning in a sea of talent." Berkeley makes you feel like you don't belong. Getting into Berkeley was a miracle. And a lot of comments about competition and stress on the campus. Financing was an important issue. And here our data allowed us to look at the resources of the parents. So this is financing from the parents' perspective. And we find out, obviously, if the family's under stress, it's much more difficult for the student, and it causes a higher rate of anxiety. The other interesting finding, which I'm sure when it comes out is going to get a lot of press, is something that in other frames has been called the helicopter mom. But we found a correlation between the education of the mother, that is, and we don't have data on the father, so excuse me, but on the education of the mother, when they have more than a college education, the rate of anxiety disorder goes up for their kids. So the consequences, and I'm going to have to be really quick now at all 3 of these schools, are, well, let me back up. The consequences are dire. What we see is dramatic increases in substance abuse and alcohol. UC and CSU's about an 8-time increase compared if you have anxiety disorder, not having anxiety disorder. We see tremendous increases in suicides and attempted suicides on both campuses. And if you have the handout, you can look at the data that we put out, and increases in sexual assaults and attempted assaults for this population. Healthcare spending goes up dramatically, and the medical cost, you can see the slope of these lines, but the soundbite to some would be that we're now spending $3 billion a year treating anxiety disorder in the United States, and the numbers here are astronomical. The thing that's very interesting is the number of students being treated in emergency rooms and being treated in hospitals. this suggests that there's definitely an increase in the severity of anxiety disorder on college campuses. Being an economist, Henry didn't tell you that I was trained in economics, though I'm in public health. We did look at the impact on their wages, and in some, if you have anxiety disorder during your college years, when you get out and get a job, all other things being equal, you're going to earn about 11% more than individuals who don't have anxiety disorder. And that starts to mount up by the time you're 30, there's a huge $5,000 difference. So what do I want from this? And this is the last thing I'm going to say. I'm not going to go through the rest of my slides. What I want is, number one, this is the first step, I think, in awareness. I'm hoping these numbers set you back in your chair and you understand how serious this epidemic is. And I can tell you there's nothing that I've seen that suggests that it's slowing down at all. In fact, to the contrary, it looks like it's increasing more dramatically. So I hope these numbers increase awareness to a couple of groups. And the number one group that I hope it brings awareness to are the faculty. And the faculty need to understand that the students that they're teaching now, in this classroom now, are going through something that they've never seen before. This is a new epidemic, this is a new climate, and they need to understand and appreciate what they're going through. It could be being more understanding when they come to their office hours, helping them seek treatment, and we really need to educate the faculty. The parents, of course, are key, and parents can spin their child one way or the other. The parents need to know this is not a normal part of growing up, being away from home. Sure, that's part of it, but we now have a new epidemic going on college campuses in the United States. And your child could be one of those suffering. And you need to be supportive and understand what's going on. And of course, today, with Chancellor Chris here, we understand that the administration, people who run our universities, are going to appreciate what's going on and do whatever they can, working with the students and faculty and others to try to treat, prevent, and to try to head off the terrible consequences of anxiety disorder on college campuses. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Katie Chu, and I'm the ASUC Mental Health Commission Chair, which serves to represent the undergraduate voice on mental health on behalf of our student government. However, I'm not only here as the ASUC Commission Chair, but also as a student who confronts the impacts of anxiety on a daily basis. Like when I have to get to class 30 minutes early to get a seat close to an exit, or abruptly leave meetings, both because of the possibility of a debilitating panic attack. Speaking from my experience, as well as the experiences of my peers, I want to be clear that the findings of this study are not new. Many of us live out the dramatic increase of anxiety on college campuses on a daily basis, and we regularly have conversations about what the student body needs. While this study echoes student narratives that the presence of anxiety on college campuses has increased significantly, especially for marginalized communities, the level of institutional support for mental health has not followed suit. The university, both its administration and its students, must make united efforts against the alarmingly increasing rate of anxiety in our community. The study shows that anxiety is affected by a wide variety of variables and isn't a siloed phenomenon. We see the impacts of financial stress when the student-driven Basic Needs Center tirelessly fights to find financial and institutional support, and when the Daily Cal publishes an article about a student who had to withdraw from the university because they felt that they didn't have any support in navigating the campus's mental health and financial aid resources. We see the impacts of academic stress when students have back to the end of time backup majors, when students feel the need to wake up at 4 a.m. to table for their clubs on Sproul Plaza, and even post videos on social media about why they felt they had to leave the university, and also when faculty refuse to put mental health resources on their syllabi. We see the lack of support of intersectional identities when student organizers from retention centers and the Queer Alliance Resource Center had to put their academic and personal lives on hold to put their bodies on the line in fighting for space on this campus during the Fight for Space campaign. Students have been experiencing the findings of this study firsthand since day one. I hope this panel can be a productive step towards including students in the conversation on how the university can and must be better at supporting its students. That's a good dramatic point. Again, I want to thank you all for coming today and joining this important conversation about how we can move forward in this journey. And now I'd like to introduce Kenna Hazelwood Carter, a doctoral student in the school psychology program in the Graduate School of Education and former president of the Graduate Assembly, who will be introducing the esteemed panelists you'll be hearing from today. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see you all here. I apologize if my speech is slightly distorted. I got braces on today. Very exciting. It's actually a perfect object lesson as to mental health here at Berkeley. I started grinding my teeth so badly my second year that I actually broke a tooth in my sleep and had to get basically entirely reconstructive dental work. So, go Bears. No, but truly, I am so passionate about this particular topic. I worked as the president of the Graduate Assembly, representing the over 11,000 graduate students here on this campus for 2 years, and in that work, really tried my darndest in every single meeting to talk about how are graduate students being impacted by this issue. It's not just an undergraduate issue. And I'm so excited that we have Chancellor Carol Christ here with us to be part of this conversation, as well as Assistant Vice Chancellor Guy Nicolette, who is our new head of University Health Services. He's only been here for 3 months, but has already been hitting the ground running and doing amazing work to try and continue to create opportunities for better service, as well as Sam Koo, who is here as the chair, I believe, or the internal director of the Undergraduate Mental Health Commission. I ask you all to join me on the stage. Part of my graduate study in school psychology is looking at how do we remove barriers to learning for students. And my particular interest has always been looking at adolescence and then what we call emerging adulthood, which goes from about 18 through 25. And one of the big issues that we're talking about here is exactly that population, and anxiety being a huge barrier to one's ability to function. But as a clinician in training, one of the things I wanted to quickly just flag is really making a distinction between just experiencing anxiety and what it means to have a clinical level of anxiety or an anxiety disorder. An anxiety disorder is when it is something that prevents you from being able to carry out your daily functions. It's when you have a larger than what would seem rational reaction to what would otherwise be considered a pretty neutral impetus. And one of the things that I am so excited about this particular report I'm talking about is the fact that we're almost seeing it being normalized. This idea that anxiety is just something that is part and parcel of your experience here on this campus. And if we're having such extreme reactions to what should be a really joyous time, a time where you can take some advised and some inadvised risks, it's something where we have to really ask ourselves, what can we do as institutions to improve people's outcomes and get them not just to college, but through college and on to a successful life? So on that note, my first question is Sam, from the undergraduate perspective, what do you see as kind of the perception of anxiety as part of Berkeley's culture?
Yeah, can everyone hear me? Okay. I would say that it's an integral part of Berkeley's culture. Among the undergraduate student body, we have this thing we call the race to the bottom culture, where everyone's constantly competing with each other, and not only competing with each other academically, but competing with each other on how poorly they're doing. So a lot of it is, I worked so hard on this project that I only got 2 hours of sleep last night. I worked so hard on this that, I'm working 2 jobs, haven't slept in days, haven't eaten today, and all for a midterm. So I think it's hard to conceptualize a Berkeley education nowadays without this academic stress. And that's why I'm glad we're here today to sort of unpack what an education here could look like without that.
And Chancellor Christ, how do you see faculty and administrators perceiving this culture of anxiety or racing to the bottom? Do you think that they're aware of it? How do you see them adapting or being resistant to these conversations?
I think the awareness is very, very different among different faculty and also in different areas of the campus. I was horrified. Had a kind of after dinner chat at Bowles Hall with a group of students, and this freshman raised his hand and said, my professor said that in a 12-hour day we should be spending 11 hours on our classes, a half an hour on exercise, and a half an hour on eating and friendship. And I thought that was said. And I think we have a huge education project with faculty to make them more aware of the kinds of things that they say that may be increasing levels of stress on students. I say often when I talk to groups of students that this institution is for you. It's for your choices. It's for what is going to be gratifying or rewarding for you. And I just hate the idea that somehow students are competing in the stress Olympics, and rather than really thinking about how can I take advantage of this period of my life to develop capacities, to develop myself, to be the adult that I want to be.
When we talk about the student experience, Berkeley is a very large school. We have, as I said, over 11,000 graduate students. We have, I think, around 30,000 undergraduates. What does that look like when it comes to showing up at the University Health Center when people are seeking help? Do you see trends in when and how people are showing up across the year?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I could tag on to a little bit of the conversation that happened here first, that I think the faculty and staff, we could do a better job of modeling the behavior that we want to see. I suspect that there's a bit of competition that happens amongst faculty and staff about how busy we are. And that, I eat my lunch at my desk and race off to a meeting and then to go do this thing, and it's 6 o'clock, but I've got this other thing to do, and it becomes a bit of a modeling exercise. And so I think certainly we could turn the mirror on ourselves. As far as what we see at UHS, yes, I mean, I have some data that I recently pulled about what we see at UHS that follows these trends. So I don't think you would learn anything more from looking at UHS-specific data. I think the timing probably is a little bit overblown. Yes, we do see more intakes during midterms or at peak times during the year. But I think right now it's a fairly constant flow of students that are looking for help, and they felt that they needed it at that time. And it doesn't always correlate with midterms or academic stress. I think it's the underlying culture that we've helped participate in that allows them to feel that whenever they feel it. That said, it's clear that the majority of intakes happen during the middle of the semester. October is a peak time, and then February, March are peak times for our intakes.
And Sam, is that something that you are seeing reflected as you do your work? And what are people actually reaching out for? Is it always showing up at UHS, or are there other resources that they're hoping to find and maybe not finding?
Yeah, I think the experience across, obviously I can't speak for everyone, but I think it's kind of important to acknowledge that there are stressors other than academics that are driving students to come to UHS. So for example, for basic needs and secure students, right, if they're waiting for their food stamps for CalFresh to kick in, then that's going to be a significant stressor. Or if there are certain political acts, hate crimes happening, then that's going to affect who's going to come in and who's going to seek resources. And in terms of seeking help, I find that a lot of people turn to peers, but then whether or not their peers are skilled in being able to help them with that process varies across the board. A lot of times it's like, okay, I know the number to Tang, here's the number to Tang, but again, there's that stigma, there's that divide on whether students will actually seek services. So then it's like, will I walk you to Tang? Will I walk you through the process, the intake process? Will I tell you what it's going to look like? And also students, there are ways that you can seek support outside of a medical lens. So reaching out to your community, reaching out to your support network. or in fact just like falling on really unhealthy ways to cope with these stressors. So as Professor Scheffler mentioned, substance abuse, I think self-medication with alcohol and other drugs is really common. So I'd say that it just is a whole variety of things across the student body.
You mentioned that different students, and particularly maybe different membership of different identity groups, might drive how people think of mental health. What are the resources that they actually feel comfortable seeking? What are the ones that they're actually able to find some sort of resonance when they do engage with it? I'm curious, especially because the data is showing that like race was a huge factor, or at least correlational, in how anxiety is showing up. And I do just want to quickly flag that race and socioeconomic status and sexuality, all of these things are not predictive. They're not driving it. They're artifacts of a society that these folks live within that is inherently hostile to them and is showing us that this is a society that does not yet know how to create spaces that is safe for people with all of these differing experiences. But how do you see, Chancellor Christ, the campus really supporting and finding ways of working with all these different groups and their individual needs?
I think it's so important to, first of all, create spaces where, sort of like the Fannie Lou Hamer Center, where students can go and feel that this is a place that understands them, that is a good resource for them. We're trying to provide counseling hours in these spaces so that mental health resources are immediately available. I also think that it's so important to just become more diverse. If you are like our African American community, 3%, you're just going to feel isolated on this campus because there's a really, really small percentage. So in part, becoming more diverse, I hope will create more of a sense of inclusion and acceptance of a wide diversity of identities.
I have a list of just some of the different groups that make up our Berkeley community, just because I think sometimes when people think students, it gets a little bit monolithic, so I just want to pull it apart a little bit. So students from traditionally underserved and marginalized populations, either because of ethnicity or race, people who are female identified, student athletes, students with disabilities, first generation students, undocumented students, low income students, homeless students, Muslim students, or other maybe not as supported religious affinity students, transgender students, and other LGBTQ students. When we're really looking at that, you mentioned the Fannie Lou Hamer Center, which is the Black Resource Center on campus for those who are not familiar with it. What else exists on this campus, and how do we route people to actually access these spaces?
Well, I'll take that one because a UHS response that we've been strongly in favor of, and we're trying to figure out how to best deploy and still utilize the resources the best we can because of limited resource, is trying to meet students where they are. So we have 11 satellite locations, and what's interesting to me, at least, about that is that therapist or those folks really get embedded within that community. And I suspect that because of the comfort level that develops with that kind of long-term relationship, that we actually do destigmatize the ability to seek help and to get care. And it doesn't have to be a let's sit down for an hour and have a formal session. It can be what we call let's talk, where it's less formal and allows a bit greater level of access for these communities to talk to that counselor. So I think we've been very successful in trying to pilot these models. We know that that's not enough. There has to be, that counselor serves a bit of everything: prevention, a bit of outreach, the clinical care, sometimes even post-vention, world. And I think we need to kind of think about how we approach the predictive nature of this and how we approach the proactive from a full campus lens that doesn't just, specify targeted groups. We need to kind of think bigger.
I wonder if I could add to what's just been said. People are very focused on housing as an issue of needs insecurity. But what's happened is the campus has grown. The campus has grown by about 10,000 students in the past 15 years. And what's happened as it's grown in that way is that we've become a commuter campus without ever really thinking about that as our identity. And so I am so aware of students just wanting places to be during the day. I mean, I often liken different kinds of colleges and universities to different kinds of communities. There are colleges that are like small towns in which everybody knows one another. Then there are ones that are like big cities, and Berkeley is like a big city. It's urban, and you have to find your neighborhood, but we make finding your neighborhood pretty hard. And the fact that, we're very focused on the cost of our low percentage of campus housing, creating difficulty in finding rental units for just about every campus population, too much money spent on housing, but it also really has an impact on students' ability, even faculty's ability, to find community.
Thank you. You mentioned that you have these satellite centers. How do you select the location for them?
Well, I'll admit it sounds a bit one by one and a little haphazard. I think initially it was request-based, and now we've started to figure out a bit more about the model, and we're going to be a bit more intentional about how to grow that program of satellite locations without diverting too many resources from the central operation. So that's still in a little bit of flux. I think stepping back a little bit, the other thing that we haven't done as well is look at data and really have data-driven decisions and data-driven decision making. And so we're in the process of really kind of picking apart the folks that do come see us, and frankly, the folks that don't come see us. Mm-hmm. That may even be more insight, or give us more insight or more meaning when we start to look at those folks that we know likely are to be struggling or possibly be struggling and not access our services, and why.
Thank you for bringing up data. I know that the Graduate Assembly did a graduate student wellness and happiness survey in 2016, and one of the big findings for us was that 64% of students who were doing graduate level work in the humanities and the arts were reporting depressive symptoms, and it was very much tied to their anxiety and fear around being able to find a job post-graduation. And whether it's academic market or any other marketplace that they're looking for, that's been a huge area of concern. So part of what drove me asking that question about how are you selecting those satellite spaces, and then to kind of pull on the second part of your response, Sam, the question of data. What questions do you think the campus should be asking? How can we do a better job of assessing what the needs of our students are?
Yeah, I think there are all of these surveys. The My Experiences survey, it rolls out all the time. But we have to look at who's responding to those surveys and who isn't. So for example, at the Basic Needs Center, we hosted these sessions where folks who had trouble navigating the English survey could actually take the survey for staff who have these long shifts, who don't have time to contribute their experience and their needs. So the questions that we're asking have to be really intentional, but also the effort that we're putting into asking these questions also has to be questioned. There are so many students who are voicing the same concerns over and over again. And I think there can be a lot of power in narrative and what students have already been voicing for years now, instead of sort of starting from square one and developing these data collecting initiatives that have been tried, haven't gotten as much traction as it should, and therefore doesn't lead anywhere.
I'm curious, if you had a magic wand, unlimited resources, even though, of course, we now have this $15 million that Governor Newsom has proposed towards UC's efforts to address student housing and hunger. which is one piece of it, but we've said that there's many other issues that we need to be concerned about when it comes to anxiety or just well-being. What would be the one, maybe two, if you really want to get adventurous, three, but I prefer two, things that you would like to see this campus do or have us begin to reconsider in our approach to mental health for our students?
I think there's several things. I mean, one is, of course, putting enough resources in counselors and therapists so that we can have appropriate crisis intervention, appropriate treatment for students that are experiencing high levels of anxiety and high levels of stress of whatever sort. But I also think we should be putting resources into wellness programming. You talked about the power of narratives. And I think it's really important to do as much as we can to give students the resources to be resilient, to handle stress, and to provide some other narratives that are not the stress Olympics or, I have to get up at 4 a.m. That was horrifying to start tabling on Sproul Plaza. That's there's a wonderful line in a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins about being to my sad self hereafter kind. And I think that that's a really important capacity to nourish is self-kindness.
Yeah, kind of like what Chancellor Chris said, I would say definitely increasing resources, but what those resources look like can look differently. So kind of what you were saying, meeting students where they are at. So that could mean physically with the satellite offices, but also meeting students where they're at in terms of what they're organizing in their communities, giving them the resources so that they don't have to put their personal and academic lives on the line just to fight to have a space on this campus. Because as we can see, when those spaces are established and they're allowed to flourish, then that power of community really kicks in to act as a support network when people aren't feeling well and they're overcome with anxiety. And
Go ahead.
I think the second part, in addition to that, is just basic needs security. Having enough resources to tackle housing, economic security, food security is going to do so much in lessening anxiety on this campus. And I think there can't really be a conversation about mental health and wellness before that happens.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was really struck, Richard, in the data that you showed in your summary of your research of the importance of the date 2008. And you said when you came back in 2008, you noticed a change. And certainly your data is showing spikes in 2008. And that's, of course, the big, the major depression that we experienced. And I'm so struck by the level of economic anxiety that graduate students, as you were saying before, can certainly show, and the undergraduates show too. So in addition to giving many more resources to housing, to basic needs, it seems to me another thing we can do both on the graduate level and the undergraduate level is invest much more in more intentional career planning that might be helpful in terms of anxiety about, I don't know what's going to happen when I graduate.
Speaking of kind of this basic needs piece, funding is a huge piece. We are looking at tuition hikes, we're looking at fees. Graduate students at Berkeley, out of all of the UC's 10 campuses, pay the highest amount of student fees. And when we're looking at these questions, I know we just signed a new union agreement with the GSIs, the graduate student instructors on campus, but the question of housing wasn't really addressed in that contract. And so where are we going to get this money? Like, how do we convince the governor? Under Governor Brown, there was clearly a preference for investing in community colleges and CSUs over the UCs. How do we show the importance of investing in these students and making sure that our well-being is put first and foremost?
I would have something really hopeful to answer to your question, Kenna. That I have been finding extraordinarily productive and promising discussions with philanthropists. The articles about student homelessness, about student hunger, are really having their impact, and I think that there are people of great capacity that will be willing to step forward and make a very substantial difference in the resources that we have, both for basic needs and also for housing. In addition, we're really lucky that we have a financial structure for at least building housing that doesn't depend on the state, which are private-public partnerships, and essentially what we find is a private partner because there's to take on the debt, because there's an income stream from the room charges or through rents, depending on what the kind of housing is.
Vice Chancellor Nicolette, UHS currently receives nearly half of its funding from various student services fees, including about 5% of its operating budget from the wellness fee. The other 50% is from service fees and co-pays. Is this actually a sustainable funding model for UHS? And what other sources of revenue could help offset the new demands on the Ting Center, especially ones that might not be coming out of students' pockets when they're already paying tuition and now having to be asked to put more money in from these student services fees?
Yeah. So I think I see my job as being able to try to adapt to a lot of different models. So I won't answer that question exactly, but technically what I want to see happen is less reliance on student fees. And that's not usually just a quick light switch fix. So we do have to look at other models. A couple of things I'm interested in are research. We don't do enough clinical research, and not only from a funding source, but certainly from more science to better inform our practice. Philanthropy, which the Chancellor's already mentioned, we historically haven't done much on the philanthropic side, and I think we really are primed to start to look at that a little bit more deeply. And then there's plenty of other options that we could consider, third-party insurance billing and things like that, to, again, put downward pressure on the student health fee. I did notice that you didn't give me a magic wand, and that's very smart not to give a physician a magic wand or a clinician, because we then just ask for more clinicians. But I'll say something somewhat blasphemous, I guess. I don't think the answer is more clinicians necessarily. Yes, we do need to meet a ratio that is set by not only just kind of gold standard industry thought, but just a common sense level of reactive clinician work, one-on-one and group sessions. But I would pour some of that magic wand effort into some of the things the Chancellor mentioned, some of these housing issues that we face, some of the basic needs issues, and frankly just trying to figure out a way, either through seed grants or through some other mechanism, ways to really change the culture here. That's where we're going to get I believe, the biggest bang for the buck, and it's not something that's going to be quick. You really have to invest in doing those things.
Yeah, I sometimes wish students would vote down the fees that they propose. That I think these are our problems to solve, and I've come to know Berkeley students as extraordinarily generous and idealistic, but I see all these very worthy causes for which there are student fees proposed, and sometimes think, why don't you vote this down and really put the burden someplace else and trying to raise that money.
Would you be willing to put an op-ed in the Daily Cal before the election next year?
I never intervene in student elections.
Well, maybe there'll be a quote in the Daily Cal from this event. Who knows? Chancellor says, vote now. I know that there's also a lot of changes that are happening at UHS. We're about to have our third insurance change in 6 years. How is that going to impact people who are getting services, whether it's at Tang directly or offsite to other specialists?
That's a good question. So it won't impact the folks that want to get services at Tang almost at all. There are minor little changes that really, I think the biggest pain point really has been that the network has different negotiated rates for those community providers. And we've been working really hard with the community providers, and most are understanding, are ready to see Berkeley students. And essentially the initial promise was that we would not allow them to lower the rates that they previously enjoyed with a different carrier. And I believe there are ongoing meetings happening right now to try to sort out the last few issues that remain. We knew this was going to be a challenging conversion. It always is. But the reason we chose this particular carrier is we wanted to set us up for a long-term success and not keep changing insurance providers. So, again, a bit more of an investment-mindedness, knowing that we would have to go through this change.
I'm curious, Chancellor Christ and Vice Chancellor Nicolette, looking at the overall costs, I think one of the problems that happens on this campus is things get siloed, right? So we have an increase in student fees, we have an increase in the cost of student housing, we have an increase in prescription costs, we have an increase in our premiums, increase in course fees, our supplemental tuitions. All of these different fees don't seem to necessarily be talked about in the same spaces. And when we talk about the cost burden being a direct impactor on the anxiety that students are feeling, how is that being tracked? Are we seeing that actually be a real conversation that's happening, whether it's at the cabinet level or in other spaces?
Absolutely. I mean, what we should be tracking is total cost of attendance. So then that seems to me most important things. People often get focused on tuition or fees. And it's really total cost of attendance that's the important thing. And then financial aid resources. Those are the two questions we should be asking and indeed are talking about.
So when we talk about total cost of attendance, and I know I'm kind of digging into this a little bit more, but incidentals such as prescription costs, right? They went up from $5 to $10 for many people this year. And so those pieces, are those included in that, since not everybody needs a monthly or daily?
Yeah, I've not seen some sort of comprehensive cost of everything that could happen, because it's so variable to be able to predict. It's an interesting thought, though, that if we took some sort of by-year average, because things do change as the campus experience goes. A freshman accesses different resources. We see it in data. We saw it in this data that freshmen and seniors likely access things differently and likely have different costs associated with that. But I haven't seen, maybe the Chancellor has, it broken down to that level of
no,
detail.
I haven't seen that either. We work very much with averages, though I have wondered often whether our cost of attendance figure isn't low for what students are indeed experiencing in large part. I'm not thinking so much of prescription drugs, but really thinking about the ways in which housing costs are so high in the Bay Area. We've recently, the Office of the President has just recently agreed to recalculate the cost of attendance every year rather than every 2 years, and that's good.
Sam, with your work with basic needs and with the Mental Health Commission, I'm sure that there's many students who would either qualify or are in fact registered with our Disabled Students Program. What are you seeing as far as their particular needs, as they are already being told legally they have the right to certain accommodations, to certain access? Are they being able to get the resources that they need, and where are those barriers coming if they're not?
Yeah, I mean, I think frontline is that people who qualify for those accommodations aren't aware that they can qualify. Or even if they're aware, they don't feel comfortable enough to actually step into DSP and say, hey, I need these accommodations. Because, you take a look around the Berkeley campus and either there are faculty directly asking you what your disability is and therefore validating what accommodation you need, which is illegal. Or, students saying, oh, I think they're just getting accommodations so that they have an easier time in class. And frankly, that's not acceptable. And it's preventing so many people, especially from communities that are marginalized, who haven't been tapped into these resources as often, from seeking the help they need. And then aside from the student perspective, also just the disabled students program is so underfunded, and as someone who is part of DSP, getting an appointment is just impossible. And once you get there, the wait times are long. And if you factor into the fact that you are a disabled student walking into that space, having to wait that long, with the increase in needs that you have with your disability, then it's kind of like, what types of stresses are we putting on these students to get the help that they need?
And I would add to that I don't think we've done as good a job as we can and will do about communication, bidirectionally. There's a lot of laws and rules around how medical things are communicated, but I think we can do better with DSP and with the student about kind of closing the circle, increasing the circle, helping the flow of communication so that you don't need more appointments to figure out what's going on, that there's good coordination between your healthcare and kind of the disability service that you're getting, the accommodations and things like that. So I'm glad you brought that up.
And we have been increasing the amount of education that we're giving to faculty in their obligations under the ADA, and we have been investing more resources in disability. Still not sufficient, but we have been increasing resources. We now have an ADA compliance coordinator for the campus, Ella Callow. And she's been here about 3 months, I think, since about January.
One of the findings was that screen time was really contributing to, or at least was correlated with increase in anxiety. I'm curious, Sam, I was introduced to Berkeley Memes for Edgy Teens by Will Morrow, who's, I guess, 2 times ago the president of the ASUC. And it seemed to be, well, one, it's on a screen, it's a Facebook page. It's the largest college-based Facebook page of its kind in the country. And if you ever see any kind of Facebook group that has a something for edgy somethings, it's based off of that name. But it also seems that students are using it as a way of expressing their anxiety and expressing this real need for more. How do you think we can maybe harness social media while also helping to address the fact that it seems to be driving a little bit more of the anxiety?
Yeah, and I think there's this really common narrative of villainizing social media as a cause of anxiety or other mental health issues, when in fact it's just a tool. And when you have something like the meme page sort of circulating all this anxiety that students are increasing, it's not that the social media is the causal factor. It's that what are the institutions that we're living in that sort of push students to feel this way, and then therefore go online to voice what they need or what they're feeling. And in terms of, I guess, solutions, it's not like we can censor them, as you shouldn't, but a lot of movements across the nation right now are sort of having more empowering content on social media and kind of rewriting the script, as opposed, instead of sort of only sharing negative experiences or sort of normalizing this toxic culture. It's really using this tool to empower students with other narratives and show that, this doesn't have to be the way it is.
Chancellor Christ, you've been using technology yourself and social media, in particular by creating a Recalibrate wellness site for students. How has that been going? How have you been able to reclaim screen time for the proverbial good?
Gosh, I'm the wrong person to ask that question. I don't use screens very much, and I have a wonderful staff that does these tools. This is not something I do. But I think, just like as with, I think it's important to think of screens, I really agree with you, Sam, as not an evil in themselves, but as something that can be a symptom as much as it is a cause, and that you can use social media in very, very different ways. So I'm very intrigued. I just was recently at the American Association of University Presidents and Chancellors meetings. These are the top 62 universities, research universities in the country. One of our major sessions was on levels of anxiety and mental illness among students. It's an issue on every single president's and chancellor's mind. And there was a lot of interest in whether there are online tools, and you would know much more about this than I, that UCLA is in fact using one that tries to, it's an online survey that identifies very high levels of anxiety and depression and lower levels, and tries to figure out whether there are any kind of online sort of cognitive therapies that can help at all. I was intrigued by what you're saying is you weren't sure that the best investment was enormously increasing our staff of counselors.
Yeah, I think that's a part of it, and you're right that there is a stepped care model. There's therapy online that does teach people. The cornerstone of treatment of anxiety is cognitive behavioral therapy. And so really that's teaching yourself or someone helping you understand these cognitive distortions and figuring how your brain works. And that can happen in a self-help way too. And certainly on a functional level, we've certainly been exploring how does UHS and TANG and CAPS use that tool, whatever tool is chosen, in the most appropriate way, so that we are continuing to not feed into the problem, but that we're offering the right help at the right time. We're still, there's a lot of work to be done. Therapy online isn't perfect either, but it's definitely a tool. And I would agree with Sam. The screen time is a symptom. It is not the only problem, and I think the more time we think about, the more effort and energy into diminishing screen time, while that might sound good, I think there's probably a limit to its effectiveness, and the diminishing returns happen very quickly. And so it's really, let's figure out why that symptom exists and use it as part of the kind of diagnostic milieu. Yeah.
There also are other things that you can provide. I don't mean in replacement of therapy, but meditation, for example, yoga. Things that help all of us deal with our anxiety.
As we have about 20 minutes left, I'd like to switch to some questions that have come in from our very lovely audience. One being, should the campus regularly screen all students proactively as perhaps an initial diagnostic tool, and then allow us to do a better job treating as we would with other epidemics?
Yeah. So there's a lot of talk about universal screening, and I think the idea has a lot of merit. I think the challenge becomes, what do you do with, particularly if it's online, how do you connect immediately with those students? How do you get them in the stream of care quickly? So I think there's some challenges to it too. I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but I think you would really have to be intentional about setting that up in such a way that you really can address any positives in a mindful way. The worst thing that could happen, said the other way, is that someone says, yes, I'm struggling, and nothing happens.
Yeah, I think we should learn from UCLA's experiment with this.
For sure.
And we're about to explore a joint research project with UCLA about anxiety and depression in our campus communities.
We have many students coming to this campus many different walks of life, many different points in their life that they feel coming to Berkeley is appropriate. How do we create an inclusive experience for transfer students and students who might have had an interrupted path in their formal education to make sure that the issues that they are facing are also being addressed and their anxieties are being seen?
Housing. I mean, I think we need housing for transfer students. It will help with the community. Then we can locate various kinds of resources in the housing itself. I think it's really extraordinarily important.
This is a question about kind of the ongoing concern that there is grade deflation that happens here on campus, and that is contributing to people's concerns when they're coming up on graduation, when they're looking for jobs. How do their GPAs stack up against other schools where it might be somewhat easier to get that 4.0 or 3.8 that they might need?
I'm really intrigued by an idea that I heard at this AAU conference that I just referenced about what Caltech does. They don't give grades in the first year. And I've often wondered whether we should do a year or a semester without grades just to allow people to get their feet on the... What do you think, Sam? Would that be welcome to students?
I think every student in the room would agree that that would be a great idea. Yeah, I don't pretend to know what the mechanisms of grade deflation are, but at least sitting in a classroom, I think the first step we can do is having faculty model the fact that your wellness is the priority, and then second comes your success in school. So having reasonable expectations from students, having attendance policies that factor into emergency situations, students with disabilities, giving extensions, making sure that for some unknown reason, our midterm season is the entire year.
I know.
I don't know what's the deal with that, but fixing that as well. But I think there are a lot of potential ways we can tackle that, definitely.
Well, to add on to that, I think just today, this morning, there was a discussion about kind of our focus on health and all policies, and the extended midterm situation came up, and its impact on the TA or the GSI that now is responsible for grading right after usually a spring break, or and the timing just goes on and on and on. And so I think if you're really thinking about kind of health impacts of these academic policies that I know nothing about, you could really start to unravel some really interesting things that, making some changes really could impact the level of academic stress and probably bureaucratic stress that students and even faculty are going through.
Speaking of faculty, I mean, this is clearly an issue of what's happening in the classroom and how it's impacting students. How do we get our faculty on board more? I know the Academic Senate has a lot of power in terms of what syllabi, policies are and that sort of thing. How do we get those sorts of spaces to also become more welcoming of hurt, right? Of pain, of being human, and instead moving from a culture that seems to be focusing on like quick failure so that way you learn and you do better, instead creating a culture of help seeking on this campus?
I think the discussion has to happen in lots of different forums certainly the Academic Senate, but also in the schools and colleges themselves and the departments. I think that's where the conversation is really best situated, and you need enough faculty that are advocates for the issue, that they can be persuasive to their colleagues. And I think your report, Richard, is going to be very helpful in this.
The climate for students of color, DACA students, Muslim students, and international students has gotten worse since the election of President Trump. This has happened since 2016, which is when the study ended. So anxiety levels perhaps even higher. How can we strategically address the model health needs of this vulnerable population, or the mental health needs, of these vulnerable populations?
I think this goes back to meeting students where they're at. So I know currently the undocumented student program has hired an independent clinician to be housed in their program. And I think if we place the people who are well equipped to deal with these issues in the communities that most need it, then that would help, as opposed to subjecting students who are already on under a lot of stress and perhaps historically, have reasons not to trust medical institutions and to seek help from there. And also I think this goes back to a larger conversation of community and diversity on this campus. It's hard to react and process these traumatic events that are happening on a national and international level when you have no one to talk to about it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's just all of it.
and add the destigmatization element that I think part of the data might support that we've had success in changing the stigma patterns, that we've allowed an environment where people do seek help more than they did in 2008. So I think you could interpret some of that in there, but I suspect for certain communities, and DACA being one of them, that it hasn't reached kind of that community. And we certainly have, even in UHS, recognized that as an issue and have a dedicated person. And it's going to take time, but I think that kind of investment pays off in the long term. And Diana is certainly working hard to do that.
I think we have to be very active in stating what our values are, and then acting on those values. I mean, all of us, and making sure we're doing our part, each of us, that this is a welcoming and generous place that really embraces all of its students, all of its staff, all of its faculty.
How will you try to educate students about the importance of self-care, and more, what are the things that they can possibly do, and what are maybe the symptoms or warning signs that they could look out for themselves? I love one of the changes that UHS made this year is having the collaborative care model. So when you go in, you take a survey and it asks you questions about your anxiety, asks you questions about your mental health, and based off of that screener, once you're seeing your primary care person, they will then bring somebody in who's part of the behavioral health team. And so there's a warm handoff instead of saying, oh, yeah, go reach out to Tang. And so I think that's a really beautiful way that we're seeing, and I know for graduate students in particular, graduate students are finally going into UHS and getting those sorts of supports that they haven't traditionally because they're afraid, in some cases, that they're going to sit in the waiting room for counseling services next to their students. And there's a lot of fear around that. So graduate students have not been seeking out help. But how else can we kind of support students in learning about self-care and then also implementing those various initiatives?
Yeah. Well, I think the easy answer is we've got a lot of resources available online. Go onto the UHS website. It's very easy to find. It's typically easy to find. I would have been remiss, thank you for bringing it up, that it's not just counseling and psychologic services that can be of assistance. The primary care clinicians are treated, they can diagnose and treat a lot of these conditions that we're talking about, but I think students they compartmentalize a little bit. We even compartmentalize a little bit and say, well, you've got to go here for this and here for that. And what we're really trying to do at Tang and at UHS in general is really break down those artificial, barriers or walls between services. And this really is about a kind of a no wrong door. I know that's talked about a lot, but a no wrong door approach. Get in the stream, and then we'll help with warm handoffs get you, the care you need at that point. And that collaborative care model is a pilot, is an attempt to try to do that in a structural, systematic way. I think I wanted to say that there's a little bit of beating up of faculty. All the faculty that I've met have been very not just advocates, but passionate about helping with the mental health and advocacy. They just don't have a structure to do it. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, there's a gold folder, and that's very helpful, but I don't think that's enough, and we need to really think about how to make it easy for them to help a student access resources, or make it easy for their department to do that.
What do you see as ways you can begin to remove those barriers?
Which of the
I mean,
barriers
you
did I?
enumerated
Yeah.
many,
Yeah.
but I'm kind of curious, like, what do you see as those major points that are deflecting people towards or away from the help that they need?
Well, I think that conversation's hard to have, even with somebody trained, to start to initiate that conversation. But imagine talking to your mentor or your faculty member that you want to be seen as doing well and academically successful. So just giving faculty and staff the tools to start to have those conversations, I think, is hugely important and would help immediately remove one barrier, because it's also challenging to go to medical care sometimes. You don't want to go see the doctor or the counselor a lot of times, and culturally sometimes that's not part of people's culture. So the earlier we can start to have conversations around mental health, self-help, all of these other factors that would lead to better well-being, the better off we are. And I think a lot of the time spent with faculty and staff would pay off in huge ways.
So, I'm curious, Sam, when you were talking about students accessing or not accessing, I know we talked a lot about, well, maybe there's cultural norms, or maybe there's like individual perceptions of, I'm not able to do this, right? I might not be that bad, or maybe this is just normal, and so maybe I'm at the bottom, so I've won. What do you see as kind of the ways in which students are accessing? Like, when do they actually make the choice to seek help? And when have you found, because again, you work with both the Basic Needs Center as well as the Commission on Mental Health, when are they making that choice not to? And how can we maybe get them, again, continue to support the work that Vice Chancellor Nicolette is trying to do?
I think, unfortunately and ironically, people, at least the ones around me, are seeking support when they're in crisis, but also they're not seeking support when they're in crisis. It's often this sort of last resort, in that, okay, like, I have put this off because I'm really busy with X, Y, and Z, and, I'm just like completely burnt out, and therefore I will go to urgent drop-in at CAPS. But then you go to CAPS and you have class from like 3 to 4 and it's only open till 5, and you don't actually get to see a counselor. And then, at least from my own personal experience and from the experience of other people I work with, that act just deters people from going in the future, because the way we perceive it is, okay, I have these needs and they're not being met, and therefore, I have nowhere to turn. But in terms of people actually accessing resources, I think a really powerful tool is, if you've had, positive experiences with TANG, with medical care and mental health care, then, teaching your peers how to access those resources, how to, what are the smart ways to, not get neglected by the people on the phone? What are the smart ways to advocate for yourself and getting into that door? So yeah, again, it's a very complicated problem.
Yeah, getting to the door can be a challenge for some people, and if the services aren't aligning with their needs or their desires, either temporarily, by time, or I think based on their own experiences and the experience of the therapist. So honestly, everybody in this room, I would, like a little homework, I would use your favorite search browser, whatever that happens to be, or your search engine, and meet the staff at UHS CAPS. And there's a pretty long list, and names and faces and interests. And I think you would see that an incredibly diverse staff of experience and interest and communities that they serve. And so I know we can find somebody for you. It's on us to, again, help you break down the barrier to get in the door, and then kind of get in the stream of care. And that's part of my challenge.
We have just under 5 minutes left. I would love to kind of give those minutes to you all. If there's anything that you'd like to share that you think are really important, that are exciting, things that are coming down the pipe, or just any kind of final comments that you'd like to make.
I think the one takeaway that I would like to give everyone is just to listen to the students. They know what they're talking about. We live through this every day. I'm amazed by all of the student organizers in my life that, work tirelessly to hopefully get heard and, hand off like all of the work that they've been doing, finally get institutionalized at some point. And then it contributes to this idea of Berkeley as this diverse, inclusive space, when, oftentimes that's not how they felt, and that's what led them to the point of having to put themselves on the line and fight for that. So yeah, just listen to students, meet them where they're at. That's about it.
I don't really have a profound closing statement. I would say that kind of from a pragmatic approach, from a kind of a functional approach, we really do want to serve every student that needs care, and I know that doesn't always happen the way we want it to, but we're working to change that. And I think bigger picture, I don't think we're going to be able to have as much impact unless we really do start to think about the culture and about some of these other policy and procedural things that the university goes through and have an impact there.
For me, the keys are really housing and basic needs and changing the culture. I mean, we can make our CAPS function as well as we possibly can, but fundamentally you have to look at root causes, and I think those are some of the important ones.
So following this panel, thank you all for being here for this amazing event. There will be a reception, and at that reception, a number of different campus-based advocacy groups that do work in this space will be there. You Mean More, the ASUC Mental Health Commission, UHS Tang Health Worker Program, the Student-to-Student Peer Counseling, National Alliance on Mental Health, as well as Path to Care will all be here. Thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon.